1 second. All right, we're live.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Mammoth Site Facebook Live for this Wednesday. Today we're here in the bone bed to give you guys a behind-the-scenes look at one of the things we do here, which is jacketing and removing bones from our sinkhole. I'm here with Dr. Sharon Weaver, who's going to go a little bit more into the process. So with that, why do we jacket fossil bones?
So Seth, a lot of fossils and bones that we find tend to be pretty fragile, and we want to make sure we can take those bones and fossils safely to wherever we are preparing them. And here at the Mammoth Site, we have a prep lab on site, which is pretty handy, but sometimes when you're out in the field, you might have to go pretty far to get to your museum and the prep lab to work on stuff. So they need to be well taken care of along that journey.
So along those lines, we're kind of surrounded by our bones, like the bones that we have here. Why do we decide to remove some bones and leave some in place?
So here at the Mammoth Site, we take every bone into consideration, and we kind of look at it from multiple different aspects. We look at what is the scientific value of that bone? Is it needed for current research? Is there somebody that's actively researching it? Do we need to remove it so that we can take measurements on all sides, for example? Or is that bone better represented in place for the public to see? A lot of our specimens, we try to leave in place, especially here, because we feel like this in itself is a collection. It's not just the collection bone storage we have downstairs. The Mammoth Site bone bed is a collection. And when we start to get individuals that are articulated, which means that they're in life order or connected together, we want to keep that kind of vision and feeling behind this together. So it kind of pulls over for the visitors and they get a real idea of the size and importance of these animals.
Makes sense. So with this fossil, so we made the determination that this one is going to be removed. What's the process before we start applying a plastic jacket? What do we have to do before, like, to get it ready for that process?
Right. So this fossil is a partial rib. It was found in 2007, at least that's when we mapped it. And when that person found it, they cleared all the sediment out around the top of it and followed the bone. And so we know the bone does not continue in this direction or that direction. Those pieces are now missing. And so what they did is they also consolidated the specimen, we mapped it, we gave it a number, so it's in our database system. And then when we start to get ready, now that we've decided that we're going to remove this, what we do is we excavate around it and kind of set up what we call a pedestal. So now this bone is sitting on a pedestal of sediment. Okay, so it's raised up. This allows us to work from the sides. Now, right before we get ready to jacket, what we tend to do is undercut it slightly. This allows us to wrap our jacketing around the edges of the specimen so that when we're done and ready to remove it, that specimen doesn't fall out when we roll that jacket over. And we'll kind of go through some of that as we go through the jacketing process.
So this one's already got its pedestal, it's ready to remove. So what tools do we need to, apply the plastic jacket?
Right, so I have here down in front of me put together a set of supplies that we're going to use today. We have our soft cushioning material. In this case, we're using paper towels. Now, a lot of places will use other places will use different materials. We'll sometimes use different materials. It really depends on the type of specimen we're working with, who is jacketing, how they were trained on jacketing, and basically the size of the specimen, preservation of the specimen, and the funding that the institution has. In some cases will help determine what kind of supportive material, cushioning material that we would use. I like paper towels, but paper towels are expensive. A lot of people will opt for toilet paper. I've seen tinfoil. I have seen things that, even like newspaper. I've seen jeans. Somebody ran out of material once and they cut up a pair of full jeans. Batting from like pillow batting and stuff like that. So there's ethicone is another really popular. So there's a lot of different materials. But basically what we want to do is we want to create a cushioning layer between the fossil itself and the jacket. So what I would do is I would take some paper towels, well, we're going to do, I guess, and we're going to kind of hold them down along the specimen. And what's nice is that we're here at the Mammoth Site and we have easy access to a lot of tools. So I'm going to use a little sprayer here and kind of get that paper towel a little damp. So I want to be careful not to get it too damp. And that's kind of a key here at the Mammoth Site because how wet we get things. But as you can see, when I dampen that paper towel, we can start to kind of mold it around the specimen. This allows it to be extra cushion and give it like a little bit of a tight fitting, which will allow us to have a slightly tighter fitting with our jacket as well.
So when we're making a jacket too, I've seen in some where they kind of keep the extra matrix or the sediment around it, they can try to keep some of that in there. I'm assuming that also is going to vary on how big the jacket's going to be, because it might get too heavy or something like that.
Yeah, so sometimes you will use sediment to help protect it. In some cases, the shape of the fossil will need to have, will create kind of holes or divots, big bowl areas, and you kind of want to build that up. That will create a better, more stable jacket. It also helps to cushion, and then also helps with storage and moving. So one thing to kind of consider once you become an expert jacket maker is how that specimen is going to rest when it's flipped over. Because the moment you flip it over to transport it, if you want it to be somewhat stable so it doesn't roll or fall over, because it'll probably be resting on that surface. And when you start to make something super big, let's say we were to jacket the skull behind us, you really want to take in consideration how that jacket is going to sit. So what we did with some of the skull jackets that we have here at the NAMA site is we've cut pieces of foam and set up a flattened surface. And so we jacket it in foam so that it's level when it's rolled over.
With a larger jacket, or something like a skull or something like that, would you rely on just the plaster to provide the support, or would you add like anything else to it?
So what I'm going to kind of show you a little bit is what kind of plaster we're going to be working with for this rib versus other types of plaster. So with this rib, we're going to be using plaster bandages. So they're preset bandages that have plaster already dried in the pores. But when you start to do something big, you're going to want to use something a little bit stronger. So what we typically do is we'll cut burlap strips, and then pretty large burlap strips, depending on obviously the size of the project. And then we'll mix plaster by hand into a slurry and create a jacket that way. So it's really dependent on the particular project you're working on. So as you can see, I'm kind of adding multiple layers as I go. You want to be kind of careful about how many layers you do add. If you have too much cushioning, you're not going to get a tight fit with that jacketing material. Just making sure I cover all sides of this rib here. Now, I'm also kind of folding over the paper towels and overlaying them across each other. And it's always good to have a jacketing buddy when you are putting stuff together, because it kind of just helps pull things into place. Now, Seth, how many jackets have you made?
Ooh, that's a tough one. As far as with my experience, I'd say I've helped on probably 10 or more, but it's one of those things where most of the jackets I've made have been in dinosaur-bearing formations, so it's a little bit different consideration because the bone has a little bit more mineralization into it. Whereas here, it's where our material, it has some of the material leached out, so it's still the original bone, just missing some of the components.
So Seth makes a good point. It's really dependent on the fossil site how you're going to be doing this jacket. There's a similar kind of method to it, but everybody does things a little bit differently. Just like everybody digs and maps things a little bit different at their sites. So you have to really kind of take it with stride. One of my favorite things to do when I go to a new fossil site is ask them how they jacket, because I learn so many new things, and it helps me to kind of adapt and try new things here at the site that we think might work better. So, another benefit to having this cushioning layer is that when you go to cut that bandage later, you have a protective layer before you get to the bone. So it kind of prevents you from cutting into the bone. Because sometimes we have to use some pretty big tools to cut into a jacket, such as like a bone saw or hand saw. Okay, plaster saw. So as I mentioned, I was going to be using plaster bandages. These are ones we get from our setup, but a lot of people will use plaster bandages that come in rolls, and those are designed typically for making casts. So let's say you were to break your arm and you get a plaster cast around your arm. It's the same same bandages they use for that. So, what's nice is that it kind of gives you this thin fabric, but within the fabric you have dried plaster. Some people will cut theirs into strips before jacketing, and some people will do it as they're going. They'll kind of wet the whole roll, but what you're going to do is kind of roll or fold it, okay? And then you're going to dip it into some water. Now, I made this water a little bit warm, so we would move a little bit quicker. It's also super cold outside, so I didn't really want to put my hand in ice cold water. But what's nice about folding or rolling is it helps prevent you from getting this too tangled. So you kind of dip it through the water so it's saturated and squeeze out the excess. You kind of unfurl it, which again, having that fold helps it from getting too tangled. And then you're going to lay it around the specimen. So I like to kind of create a crisscross pattern at least. That kind of gives the specimen a little bit more structure and support. And then you kind of rub it to fill those pores in. So the plaster fills in all those pores, and you get like a tighter feeling.
So with plaster, like how much like working time do you usually like try to budget for when it comes to the plaster starting to set up?
So that's really just dependent on the amount of humidity of where you are and how hot it is outside, and again, whether or not you're using that warm or cold water. So you can kind of start to tell when it starts to set up. When plaster and water mix, you get a little bit of a chemical reaction, and so it tends to warm up as it dries. But I mean, if it's a super humid, rainy day and stuff outside, it might take a day or two for it to dry. But again, we're inside here at the man site. We have very dry sediments here, so this will probably be dry in a couple hours.
So when it comes to storing a plaster jacket, are there any considerations that you might need to take into effect for something that's going to be stored short term versus long term?
So I would recommend that if you're using tin foil or aluminum foil as your separation layer, as your cushioning layer, that you plan on not storing it too super long. With paper towels and toilet paper and things like that, jackets, they tend to last quite a while if made properly. There are jackets that are sitting in museums that have been sitting there for 50, 60 plus years. But if you want to try your best not to let things sit that long, we try to prep things as soon as we have them out, but that is also hard because, for example, a skull could take us years to prep properly. So there is a little thing right here. You want at least couple layers of plaster on it. Now, if you're doing something larger, you're going to probably want more layers. Also, if you're doing something larger, for example, if you were doing that skull, we probably build in other support structures. We have used things like rebar, 2x4s, all kinds of crazy things. I don't know. We jacketed in ropes and other structures to help kind of support it as it goes.
So with like something like let's say you're excavating something and you're miles and miles from civilization, and it's going to be you realize as you get the jacket kind of set up that it's way too heavy for your team to lift. Are there any chances when that happens? Like, are there any like routes you can take?
Get more people.
More people?
or a helicopter involved. There are cases where people take helicopters out to help transport stuff. You can try to roll it over into a cargo net of some kind so it's easier for people to lift. One thing that happens with plaster is that it can get kind of sharp, and so I'll talk about that here once I make my plaster slurry, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And so if you're holding it up against yourself, you can scrape your arms up pretty good if you're not careful. Alright, so I did a pretty thick layer of plaster bandages on this. Probably wouldn't have done something this thick if we were just doing it on our own, but for the video I wanted to make sure that we can see really well. jacket. Now, for a larger specimen, the next step that we probably do is would use clean water. I'm just going to use this water here, which is fine for this kind of level of a project. And we're going to make a plaster slurry. So this would be the same kind of thing that we would make with the burlap to make larger bandages. I actually have a little bit too much water, so I'm going to pour some of it out real quick.
So once this jacket's finished setting up, it's going to kind of look like this. Right here, this is one that we've made to kind of show, like, as a demonstration tool. So as it sits, you're going to have the shell on top. So like as we mentioned with the undercutting and the pedestal, what you want to do is you want to kind of flip it carefully over, and then you can see you've got your fossil and your other material on the other side. Now if you have to transport it a long ways, you might put plaster on this side as well to kind of act as like a cocoon to kind of protect it. But this one, since this one's used for demonstration purposes, you can kind of see the fossil and then the sediment around it. We often call the sediment the matrix. It's basically all the rock around our fossil. And with this one, then you can use tools to gently remove the sediment until you have just the fossil or as much of the fossil as you want exposed. Ready to go?
Yep.
Awesome.
Okay, so I just poured a little bit of the water out because I had a lot for what we're doing. But what we're going to do is we're going to take powdered plaster. So this plaster is like a quick setting plaster. And we're going to mix it with the water to create that slurry. Now, you always want to go plaster to water, not water to plaster. It's just kind of the methodology to it. You're going to pour the plaster in until it's no longer like completely soaking in. You see like a little bit of pile, and then you kind of mix. And what you're looking for when you're going to wrap a burlap bandage, you're going to look for something that's not quite thick, but not quite thin. You want it to coat your fingers like a glove. But we're making a slurry to cap our jacket, the top of it here, so we want it actually pretty thick. So there's two ways of making it thicker. You can add more plaster, or you can just keep mixing. And if you keep mixing, that will, again, like I said, warm up. You add too much plaster to water, it will actually create a weaker jacket. So it's just kind of a learned process, I guess. You learn by doing kind of thing. Once it starts to mix up and thicken up, it'll thicken up pretty quick. So you also want to make sure that you're fully prepared. So what a lot of people do too at this stage is they'll make a label for the specimen. So let's take all that information, the number of the specimen, what the specimen is, who found it, where it was found, write it on a label. They'll put it in a little Ziploc bag, and they'll actually jacket that label on top, which is nice because you can create it in a way that you can still read the label and access it if you need to later. Other people will just take a Sharpie once it's dried and put all that information on top of the Sharpie.
And I'm assuming with this, redundancy is better just because that way in case one label gets scraped off or something happens, you always have some way of knowing this is where this fossil came from, correct?
Exactly, especially if you're working in a museum that goes to more than one fossil site. I mean, here, our fossil specimens are mostly coming from the mammoth site. So we know it's mammoth site, but we don't want to kind of risk us not knowing what we're working on or what we're doing or losing information. With writing with a Sharpie, that can wear off over time. So you also want to consider the length that jacket might be sitting in place. So I've made this slurry. It's pretty thick now. Could be a little bit thicker. And we're just going to kind of lay it out on the specimen. And so part of this is to help thicken up a jacket that's super big. So like I said, if you're doing a skull, you want a pretty thick, stable jacket on top. But for something small, you may want to do it just to kind of create that baby butt smooth, can I say that? Piece of butt kind of feel that you get, so that it's not going to scrape you later. And so you kind of create a little bit of paste, and it can kind of help fill in some divots, or that can help you kind of build that nice flat layer for that jacket to sit on. So with this rib here, you can see that it's easily going to rest on that and not roll off the table, which is going to be kind of important later.
And with that, I assume it's also important to have kind of that even surface too, so we don't have gravity before part of it's kind of up in the air and then break along that point.
Yeah. you have any more questions?
That's all I can think of at the moment. Are there any questions from Facebook?
We do not have any questions from the viewers.
What about the people in their background here at the
Any
NAM
other
site?
questions?
Do you guys have any questions? How long will it stay on there? So we'll remove this probably tomorrow. The jacket will stay on until we get it done in our prep lab to clean the fossil, work on the fossil correctly. We try not to leave things on too long, but sometimes it's gonna be a couple years before we get to it. It just really depends on the specimen, how much work that needs to be done, and how important it was to look at it, or to conserve it. We have some specimens that we remove from the bone bed that just need some extra help and attention, and so that is best done in the prep lab versus the bone bed.
Give you more controlled environment, correct?
Exactly. What is this bone? This is a rib bone, a partial rib. So now that we have that nice slurry, I have some leftover plaster in the bucket, and the easiest way to clean that up later is to just let it dry, and then just kind of crack the bucket, and you can just kind of pour it out into a garbage can. One thing I did do that I typically do is have another bucket with water in it so I can wash my hands off.
As you can see, this is it can be a pretty messy process, so you want to make sure that you're wearing clothes that you're okay with getting some plaster on, but you also want to make sure you're moving very carefully, that way you don't get, a shoe covered in plaster. With that, I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Feel free to post any questions that you have on the bottom of the video, and with that, we'll see you next time.